Going to Church with Marcion, this is a new chapter in the book that will appear hopefully soon. Um, and I've got a pre-existing video on the Marcion course. What happens when you join the Marcionite Church? What do you see? What are the experiences that you have? What are the rites that you undergo? Would you be able to distinguish the Marcionite Church from, say, the Roman Catholic Church? You know, um, Likewise today, it's sort of like asking if you were to go into a Kingdom Hall of the Jehovah's Witnesses, would it look very much different than a traditional Baptist service? This is kind of a way of approaching this topic. So one of the things that we know, even in the fourth century, uh, a bishop of Jerusalem called Cyril was emphasizing to Christians who were baptized, who were faithful members of the church, that one of the things he said to them, even in the mid fourth century, is that if you're visiting other cities and towns, don't ask simply where the Lord's house is or where the church is, but where the Catholic Church is. Because chances are, if you just enter a city or a village and you say, where's the local Christian community? They're going to take you by the hand and lead you to the Marcionite community. And so you'll sit down in the pew, and apparently, I'm just joking about pews. They really didn't have those, but you would sit down in the church, and apparently you wouldn't notice that this church was any different from your church back home until, the pastor got up to preach, and you realized that he never had a reading from the what Christians called the Old Testament. And so that would be one of your flags that they don't have readings from the Old Testament. Okay. But that wouldn't be so unusual. I mean, you could still listen to the sermon from the Gospel or the epistles of Paul, and you'd hear some pretty similar stuff that you would hear in other churches. And you would go see they practice baptism, and at the end of the service, they had a ritual meal called the Eucharist, and they had bread and wine there. And apparently some communities had milk and honey, which they would also distribute. But then again, that wouldn't have seemed strange to you because in antiquity, they also used milk and honey in some communities, early Catholic communities. So that wouldn't have seemed strange to you. And then when you walked out of the service, the pastor would have shook your hand and sent you off. And maybe it wouldn't have felt very much different at all. But Cyril, who is an early Catholic bishop, he's worried about tithing, and he's worried about making sure that he's got the funds and that he's got the authority. And so he doesn't like other church communities in competition with him and not recognizing his authority. So certainly by the fourth century, the early Catholics have started calling themselves by distinct names, Catholics. But this is one thing about Marcion's church that I think everyone should know, that Marcion intended to form a Catholic church in the Greek sense of Katholiki. Your Katholiki ecclesia is your universal church. And so what's the difference between a church and a universal church? Well, it's simply saying that in your universal church, the intent is to have a church in every town, right? And that these churches are in networks and that they communicate with each other. They write a letter to each other. They have similar celebrations. They have ambassadors go from city to city. They have, invite people to have the Eucharist with them. And they are networked in such a way so that they have a common identity and a common authority structure, so that the Catholics, have a central bishop in the main city, and then they have subordinate leaders in the towns and villages. And that's what it means to be a Catholic church. But Marcion's church was also Catholic in that sense, and he wanted not just a church in a local town or community. He didn't just want to stay in Rome or to stay in Pontus. He wanted a church on every continent, and that's what he accomplished. It is just one of those random facts of history, or random, it's not really even a fact, but it's just a phenomenon of history, that the church that got to call itself universal is the church now known today as the Catholic Church. That name stuck to them. And why did it stick to them? Well, because by Cyril's time, they actually got the state funding, right? So they actually could spend millions of dollars on very pretty church buildings and pilgrimage sites and actually choke out the competition, often very slowly through simple economic means, but sometimes through use of greater force. But in terms of the second century, did Marcion have an intent to be Catholic-y? Did he want his ecclesia, his church, to be Catholic-y? Absolutely, he wanted to have a Catholic church in that small c sense of a general worldwide church. An ecumenical church is what we would call it today. And of course, that is what bothered the competition, okay? Because that means that they weren't distinctive in that respect. And they certainly wanted to say that we are the only universal church. Now we have an interesting inscription. Actually, Harnack says that this is the very first inscription that was carved by a Christian church, and it's I don't know if that's true today, but it's something that the modern Marcionite church likes to repeat. And according to this inscription, which is near Damascus at a small town called Levava, we have reference to a synagogue of Marcionists of the Lord and Savior Jesus the Good, under the care of Paul the presbyter in the year 318 or 319. Of course, they didn't have that dating system. I've just updated that. And Harnack talked about this over 100 years ago now, and not many people know about this, but it's an interesting inscription. If we look at it in the Greek, we have literally a synagogi Marcionis stone. That's the synagogue of the Marcionites in the village, the Comes of the Levavites. And it's unclear whether the village is owned by the Lord and Savior Jesus Christ or whether the synagogue is owned by the Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. But when they refer to Christ, if any of you know Greek, they don't refer to him with an iota, they refer to him with an eta. So literally, Jesu Christou is not Jesus Christ, but Jesus the Good One, because Christus means good. And then the name of their local leader is a guy named Paul, pretty common name among Christians at this time. And he called himself a presbyteros, that is what we would refer to as a local pastor. And so that's interesting. Here we have Marcionites who are supposed to be, Harnack was very surprised by this because he thought that Marcionites were anti-Jewish, but here the Marcionites are calling themselves a synagogue. So, he was worried about that, but maybe he should have taken that as evidence that they weren't as anti-Jewish as he thought. But here's evidence that we've got a Marcionite community. By 318 or 319, they've got their own building, and they've labeled it with a stone inscription. And they are, they are trailblazers. Other churches aren't doing this. But of course, Jewish synagogues had done this for centuries, and other Greco-Roman buildings had done this for centuries. You put up a plaque outside your religious building, basically. And so this is what they did. And so now we know that they exist. And if there was a Marcionite church in this very small town, well, then there was probably a bigger one in the big town, Damascus. Levava is about 3 miles away from Damascus. But it's just by chance that this particular inscription survived. So that proves that Cyril had a lot to worry about, because if one of his congregants went to the local Syrian city of Levava and they asked for the church, they would have been led to that one. Okay. And they would have seen Marcionite baptism. Now, one of the reasons we know that Marcionite baptism was not very different from Catholic baptism is that even in the mid-3rd century, the so-called Pope, who's really, not really equivalent to what we think of as Pope, but he's the early Catholic Roman bishop, a guy by the name of Stephen I, explicitly says that if you're Marcionite and then you become Catholic, you don't need to be rebaptized. We recognize Marcionite baptism. So here's an early Catholic saying that, there's nothing inherently wrong with Marcionite baptism. So if you're baptized in a Marcionite church, that's good enough for us. Okay. Why was that? Well, because the actual ritual wasn't different, and the actual things said during the ritual weren't different. They still said all the things that Catholics said and still did all the things that Catholics did. So in that respect, if you're looking at it from the outside, it's not very different. But what was different was certain commitments that you made after being baptized. So if you get baptized in the Roman Catholic Church, they do not require you to stop having sex. But in Marcionite's church, they did. So celibacy is an absolute requirement, and that becomes a requirement after your baptism. Now, does that mean that every single Marcionite is celibate? No, actually it doesn't, because you don't have to be baptized in the Marcionite community. Marcionites who were baptized entered the full membership of the church, but you could be what was called a hearer or catechumen, that is a kind of sub-member or beginner. And in that state, you didn't have to stop practicing sex. They encouraged you, but they didn't force you to be baptized. So you could spend your whole life as a non-baptized member in the Marcionite church. And it was a habit in antiquity that you would only get baptized at the latest possible moment, because obviously, since baptism forgave sins, you wanted to delay it as long as possible, because, like, basically to your deathbed, because you wanted to ensure that when you died that you were sinless, didn't have to pay for anything additional. And according to Epiphanius in the 4th century, he says that Marcionites did repeat baptisms. We don't know if that's exactly true, but I find no strong reason to disbelieve that. Why would they do repeat baptisms? Well, probably because people screwed up. And you can make a commitment to celibacy, but as we've seen in recent priestly scandals, that doesn't mean that you'll keep it. I mean, the human body is the human body, biological drives are biological drives. And bada bing, bada boom. I don't need to talk about the birds and the bees. So you can totally mess up, especially in a church where you have that kind of very strong, strict commitment. And so then that would require a repeat baptism. I think that's possibly what was going on. But again, we don't know. That's my sense of my reconstruction. There's a big hullabaloo about whether Marcion allowed for increased female leadership. And there's a couple of interesting points here. I personally, I don't think that Marcion's church was like a vanguard of female liberation. Um, I wish it was, but it's probably not the case. But there are some interesting facts about Marcion. Um, One of the things to keep in mind is that, when you think of celibacy, you're like, oh crap, that really is a big commitment. I really like to have sex, so I'm not going to join that church. I don't want to be a full member of that church, basically. Um, and that makes perfect sense to modern people. But in the ancient world, actually, celibacy was a good thing for one class of people, and that was for women. Because if you were married, you were basically, I mean, this wasn't on paper, but you were basically controlled by your husband, right? If you were a woman in antiquity and you were married, your husband controlled everything, the finances, the house. He owned most of the things, and you had very, very strict rules about what you couldn't do. And so for women who became widows where their husband died and they outlived them, they would inherit all that, all the husband's riches and property and so on and so forth. They could definitely own things, but then it would be disadvantageous for them to then remarry, because then they'd have to give all that to their new husband. So actually, like a lot of people like intuitively like, or how would Marcionite churches grow when they required celibacy for full members? Because the best way to grow a religious movement is to have kids and then to indoctrinate them. So if there's not a lot of Marcionite kids, then their movement's not going to grow. But it did grow. So how do we explain that? Well, one way of explaining that is that you had a lot of rich women joining the community, widows who had a lot of money and made some very big donations. And they actually were empowered by a commitment to celibacy, which was a commitment not to remarry. And it's true today that, the most people who go to church are women. Most people who donate are women. So if you can get a church full of rich women who are extremely committed enough to be celibate, who are in their 50s and 60s, you can grow a movement. I mean, it can be done. One tradition that we have from Jerome is that Marcion sent a female leader ahead of him to Rome. Now, no one else says this, and so we don't know where Jerome gets this. But if he's right, then Marcion would look sort of like Paul, because Paul is also sending women around. He mentions women like Phoebe, who are advancing his message. So there's nothing incredible about Marcion sending a female ambassador ahead of him to sort of prepare the way, but it's singly attested. So it's not like anyone else is saying that. So we and Jerome, has a tendency to mix things up. So we're not fully convinced by that, but that's still interesting. Epiphanius says that Marcionites allow women to baptize. Maybe this was a change because Epiphanius is, living in the 4th century. So that's 200 years after Marcion. So maybe they made some changes. But if he's right, that's really interesting, because no other church was doing that. Certainly not the Catholic Church. I mean, it was a all male fraternity, all male club. Still is today for the Roman Catholics. Women cannot be priests, neither then nor now. and they cannot baptize. They cannot say the mass. So if you had baptizing Marcionite women, that would be quite extraordinary. And then we have mention of a Marcionite female, a martyr in the mid third century. If you get martyred, that means you have some degree of importance. So we don't know her name, unfortunately, but we can still remember her and tell her story. But what she tells is by inference that women were important. Maybe this was one of the Marcionite church leaders who actually led a Marcionite community. You know, why would you pinpoint, some nobody, some lady in her 60s who, did nothing but attend a Marcionite service and then, burn her at the stake? No, you wouldn't pinpoint someone of no significance. You would have to pinpoint someone of big significance, because the point of killing someone, if the state is going to go to the trouble of killing someone, then they are going to do that. They're going to pick the leadership to scare everybody, because killing is a deterrent. So that female martyr, even though we don't know her name, still has an important story to tell. So maybe, just maybe, compared with the early Catholics, Marcion was more friendly to female leadership. Marcus Vincent has recently argued that in Marcion's Gospel, looking at chapter 23, he thinks that it emphasizes Mary, and there's one other woman who is a witness to the resurrection. And it is true that you have the Mary is sometimes called Mary Magdalene, and sometimes called the apostle to the apostles, because she first sees the resurrection, and she's the one who goes and tells the 11 at that point. And of course, they disbelieve. And in canonical Luke, there's an added story that Peter then goes to the tomb and then verifies that the tomb is empty. And then, the other disciples are kind of like, oh, okay, well, maybe she's right. But that wasn't in Marcion's Gospel. In Marcion's Gospel, it was sufficient that you had a woman testifying, being the first one to testify that the tomb was empty, then that Jesus had been raised. So that's significant. And Vincent says that in this respect, Marcion's Gospel seems to follow the tradition of Marcion's understanding of female authority. Whether it does or not, I'm not sure. It's a little bit difficult to make concrete judgments about this. It is the case that Marcion's Gospel has a woman as the first witness to the resurrection. But then again, actually, so does the Gospel of John. And, early Catholics obviously have that as well, and yet they still don't allow women to be priests. So, when you're looking at the sacred stories of a religious community, that sometimes doesn't necessarily map onto the actual practice of a religious community. So that's something to keep in mind. But it's still worth pointing out and interesting, I think. And that's just where that essay appears. It's in a book called Patterns of Women's Leadership in Early Christianity. Another expensive Oxford book. And that's Marcion. And I think there's more to say, obviously, and I've said more in the Marcionite Going to Church video, which is on the Introducing Marcion course, the pre-recorded version. But that is, a little bit of extra, just food for thought, for thinking about, what's the same and what's different for Marcion's community. I think, again, if you were to take a time machine and plop down in Asia Minor or Syria or North Africa, and you were just walking around trying to find the Christians, I think chances are you would have walked into a Marcionite community. And if you compared that with the early Catholic service, you, again, might not have seen a lot of differences. And it might have taken you several Sundays to recognize that they're actually saying something different. Now, of course, the theologians and the intellectuals are, they're out there trying to tell you, like the priests and bishops today, trying to tell you that, oh my God, those people over there, those Scientologists, they are fundamentally different than us, because they have all these weird beliefs. And so they focus all of the difference on the weirdest beliefs, the most extreme beliefs they can imagine. But actually, if you just go to a Christian Science meeting or a Scientologist meeting or a Jehovah's Witnesses meeting, it's not really amazingly different from, the local Baptist church or even the local Methodist church down the road. I mean, it really is. It comes down to it's a people gathered together trying to do what they consider to be the Lord's work, having a liturgy, and with readings from a Bible, and then a sermon, and then a short ritual meal, and that's it. And so, in terms of practice, there might not have been a huge difference, and that's really important also when considering Marcion's growth. He it's not like he was just a parasite on the early Catholics. In fact, I think you can make the argument that in terms of organization and church structure, the early Catholics learned some things from him, which then they employed in order to create their church network, which was, again, a competing universal network. And that's what Catholicity means. Um, but as you know, history would have it, Marcion didn't become the state church, and so he didn't get to call himself the universal church. Then that's still with us today. In antiquity, it hadn't yet become distinctly Jewish. A synagogue could still be used for a group gathering, even if you were, not Christian or Jewish. A synagogue literally means you could translate it as a convocation or conventicle, or there are other kinds of translations for it. You don't always have to translate synagogue by synagogue. Although, again, I mean, it is still interesting because even in antiquity, it was beginning the process of Jews were starting to own that term. And of course, Christians used more terms distinctive to them, which were ecclesia, which is the translation of church. But originally, ecclesia was a much broader signification that just meant assembly, and it could refer to your local governmental assembly as well. But eventually, as time went on, the Christians started to own that language, and so that's kind of what happened. It's another reason to rethink the anti-Judaism of Marcion. Certainly, I don't think they were any more anti-Jewish than early Catholics, so they had no problem with using synagogue. And as you know, yeah, even if you do consider the Jews as enemies, you can still pirate their what works. This is what religious communities do all the time. It's called syncretism, where they'll take something that works. And for Christians, you can think of the two-part Bible as something that they pirated. That's not a neutral word, but we could say something like that they adapted from Jews, that you have your sacred scriptures and you have a sermon and you have a reading. All that is traditional Jewish stuff that Christians just took over. In terms of the structure of their liturgy, they weren't original with that at all, and so they ran with that. So again, if you're in competition with another religious community, that doesn't mean that you're not borrowing from them. And if the Baptists see look across their shoulder and see that the Scientologists have this really great website, or this newfangled way to get more converts, well, heck, they would use that too. I mean, it's not tainted because the Scientologists used it first.
Yeah.
Well, two-tiered memberships are very common. You could have two or more tiers of members, and it's not only the Manichaeans. I mean, it actually still is the Roman Catholics today. I mean, you have actual monasteries and you have nunneries, where you have people making greater commitments to celibacy. And I don't think Roman Catholics articulate it in quite this way, but they do think that those people are more holy, and because of those extra commitments. I don't know if they're more Catholic than the others, but I think that you can still view that as a kind of multi-tiered membership, and that's very common. I mean, you might think that Marcion would have liked the Virgin Mary because, of course, she is a virgin and should be a nice model for female celibacy. But in fact, for Marcion, the Virgin Mary is a corruption, right? And why is that? Because he does not believe, because the Lucan birth stories come after Marcion, right? And it's Luke, the editor of Canonical Luke, who's the architect of the Virgin Mary. Obviously, Matthew has a story about the miraculous birth as well, but it's really Luke who gives you the real drama of Mary the Virgin and makes very explicit that she's not having any sex. It's the Lucan editor who invents the story of the Annunciation, that is Gabriel's visit to Mary, in which he explicitly tells her, you're going to have a kid. And Mary's like, oh, well, I do not know a man. And then the angel has to, as I say, give her divine sex education, kind of like, no, a Holy Spirit is going to come upon you, and sort of tell her how the mechanics of all this is going to go. I think for Marcion, we don't have a birth story of Jesus. So, the tendency of scholarship is to say, well, for Marcion, who hated the body and must have believed that Jesus descended immediately from heaven at age 30. Well, that's just an inference that you get from the heresiologists. I mean, my sense of it is that we don't know But I don't find any reason to believe that Marcion didn't think that Jesus didn't have a normal human birth. I don't think, yeah, I don't think for Marcion Jesus was born of a virgin, and that's perfectly okay. But on the other hand, I don't think that for him he descended immediately from heaven. Um, so, you know, ultimately we don't know, but I think we don't need to follow the heresiologists either. Right. Yeah,
So,
that's another motive to kind of, well, to increase Jesus's purity and also to, yeah,
right.
protect his deity, right? And then, of course,
Yes.
they expand that in later tradition, making Mary kind of like the mother of God. And so even she was virgin born, according to later tradition.
It's
Um,
very Catholic.
it's very Catholic. Yeah, that's the line that they ran with. And, so in some sense, I don't like to emphasize the disagreements between early Catholics and Marcionites because I think it's probably true for both early Catholics and Marcionites that they view sex as in some way defiling, right? That it's problematic. And of course, this is something that the Roman Catholic Church, is still trying to run with this line, even after 2,000 years or 1,500 years, or, wherever you think that this emphasis really started. Um, they're still trying, they're still have a structure of authority in which the greatest authority is put in the hands of celibate or supposedly celibate priests. And of course, they're not celibate. Some of them are pederasts and criminals and convicts, and then they just move those people around. But yeah, I think the whole issue here is for us, that's deeply problematic, But for someone in antiquity, that's not just a Christian insight, that's something more widespread. For instance, even in Greco-Roman indigenous religions, you're not supposed to go into a temple if you had sex the previous night. You have to wait an extra day. Um, and we read all these things in Leviticus about seminal emissions and being defiling and so on and so forth. But as Jason mentioned, we do find these inscriptions for religious associations, and some of them do mention, if you've had a seminal emission, if you've had sex the previous night, please don't come join the community. Um, and we have regulations and bylaws for religious groups, which say that if you've committed adultery, you're out. So it's not like, and of course we have religious groups like the Sibylian Addis cult, where the priests in that cult, they not only commit to celibacy, they actually cut off their own testicles. So, it's not that Christianity is utterly unique in its commitment to saying that somehow sex is defiling. A lot of groups were doing that, and there must be something very deep in the Indo-European kind of like strain, that is informing that concept. And I'm not a sexologist, or I don't study this in particular, but it seems to me that this goes way, way, way back, thousands of years prior to Christianity, where these sorts of attitudes develop, and then they get transmitted in different ways in different religious groups. I don't know the full story to that. If anyone has a good book to recommend, let me know. But obviously today, someone would say, well, that's a problem. Sex is good. So that's not necessarily the case for these people. And I don't know if they're right or wrong. And but I do want to understand them. I also want to overcome the kind of glib saying that a lot of, mainstream Christians have, that like where they're sort of haughty, they're like, oh, well, of course these Gnostics and Marcionites never survived because they didn't allow sex. Well, historically, that's not really true. I mean, all of these groups came down in slightly different positions. And it seems that for Marcion and Marcionites, as long as you were non-baptized, you could still have sex. Obviously, I mean, they didn't want you doing that out of marriage. But if you were not baptized, then you could still have sex within marriage. There was no prohibition against that. So whenever you hear people saying like, "Oh, well, Marcion forbade marriage," that's just not the case. Married people could still get baptized in Marcion's community, and they could still remain married. How is that? Well, married people have a commitment to celibacy. I mean, let's face it, you get into your 60s and 70s. I mean, is that really a problem? Like your sex drive is already pretty, reduced. So, I mean, it's not amazing that you would make sort of that commitment later in life. So, does it mean is it the reason why Marcion's church died out? Well, that's a stupid comment to make when you look at the history. Like Marcion's movement lasted 9 centuries. So if your argument is that, oh, well, you died out because you didn't allow enough, people to have sex. Well, I mean, I still think it's a pretty darn successful movement to last 9 centuries. I mean, heck, that's 3 times as long as America has been around. And that's pretty cool. I would say that's a 5-star A plus, rating for a business. 9 centuries, pretty good. I mean, I'm not going to be able to start a business that's 9 centuries. I mean, well, who knows, right? Maybe you guys want to spread the movement, but like that is totally successful. Like that's really successful. The same thing with the Manichaeism. People are like, oh yeah, Manichaeism, another religion that died out. That's another like stupid, naive statement. Like, well, why don't you go start a movement that lasts 15 centuries and then, then you can start making fun of people who die out. um, and of course, again, if you're really interested in history and being historically accurate, again, what we're seeing in the fourth century is that, yeah, the early Catholics are sincerely worried. They're sincerely worried. And if you go back to that time, in Jerusalem, Marcionites may have had more people in their church. In Damascus, they might have had more people in their church. In areas like Edessa, they might have more people in their church. So numerically, they're doing well. And we know that they especially did well in the East, where there's already an emphasis on, uh, you know, celibacy. So as a sign of greater holiness. And then, again, the Roman Catholics, they learn from the Marcionites. I mean, where do you think like monasticism isn't invented out of thin air in the third century? You can view it as the early Catholic response to these more ascetic or holiness groups who are demanding more stricter requirements for their membership. And so the early Catholics then get on the bandwagon and they say, oh, okay, well, we'll have monks and nuns. We'll get on that bandwagon too. Um, they come late on the scene, and then they find a system that works, and they're still with us today. So in a sense, Marcion's ideas and his organizational structures haven't died out at all. They still exist. They exist in the structures of the competing church, which has simply adapted what he tried to do. And then, because they had the money and the funds and the kiddos, yes, well, obviously they did well, and they're still doing well. Some Roman Catholic families in the States pride themselves on 9 or 10 children. I'm sure in places like Latin America, that's still very much of a badge of honor. So I'm not saying that that doesn't make an effect, but I am saying that it's sort of naive to, you know, say who or what is or is not a successful movement based on the criteria of celibacy. I do agree that there's different schemas for understanding baptism by early Christians and Christians today. And I think what's happening is that Christians today and in antiquity, they had multiple schemas for understanding baptism. So it was forgiveness of sins, that's also in Luke. It was dying and rising with Christ, that's in Paul. It was ascending to heaven, that's in Colossians. And obviously other groups had variations on all of that. But what tends to happen is that if you choose one scheme, if you choose to emphasize one schema, like dying and rising with Christ, that doesn't mean that the other schemas are thrown out. It just means that there's overlapping schemas and ways of understanding baptism that one could activate, and emphasize at different times. I think it's all kind of, a collage that is uh, wrapped all together in the Christian brain, and it kind of exists at the same time. And so I wouldn't say that historically, Marcion is like, oh, well, yeah, baptism, that means you're buried with Christ. So that doesn't mean that your sins are forgiven. No, I think that they all agree on baseline that baptism is the forgiveness of sins. And then they add additional parts to that, different ways of understanding that, which aren't viewed as mutually exclusive.